Well, the appalling crimes committed by grooming gangs are back on the political agenda for various reasons. Now, some people approach this issue from the Tommy Robinson type angle. You can imagine some people hearing about it, hundreds of girls, thousands of girls raped, and they wouldn't look up. But then you hear, it was Pakistani Muslims. They go, right, okay, right, we're very interested in this. This is an issue we're really going to campaign on. Now, obviously, that's not a healthy attitude. Now, we've also got Nigel Farage, the Reform Party, are making quite a big thing of it as well. I will say again that there's a part of their motivation is playing this as an immigration and Islam, a cultural issue. That's not invalid. That's not invalid. But if that's the only angle you approach this from, I think that is unhelpful. Then we've got the Labour Party. The Labour Party, they would normally be very hot on violence against women and girls. They'd be setting up committees and groups and policies left, right and centre, real top priority. But then when it comes to actual sexual violence against women and girls on an absolutely huge scale, well, they go a bit quiet because they don't want to get into the cultural immigration Islam aspect to it. But I'm not going to talk about the cultural and the immigration Islam aspects of it this time. I've talked about those on other occasions. I'm going to talk about some other factors that have enabled this huge crime to take place. Now, these are the factors. They'll be ignored by the likes of Elon Musk and Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson. It's not the sort of thing that they're interested in. Well, I've talked about some of them before, and some of them are also detailed in this book, Unprotected, written by Norman Wells, who was director of the Family Education Trust. The book was published in 2017. I think sadly Norman died of COVID. The book is brilliant, very insightful. And what it does is it collects material from the reviews and the investigations and the inquiries that were published about the grooming gangs in particular parts of England. It doesn't cover any in Scotland, but ones in England. So he's gone through them, found common themes and pointed out things that need to change. I mean, the case is unanswerable. The book is so brilliant, powerful, and obviously full of common sense and straightforward things to do to tackle the problem of grooming gangs in the future. It's so brilliant, it's been totally ignored, obviously, by governments across the UK. Totally ignored. So what does it say? What can we learn from it? I've added a bit to these, changed some of it, but it's basically from this book. So there's 9 points, 9 things that enabled or facilitated or aided these grooming gangs in their nefarious activities. Right, number 1, the normalisation of underage sex in our society and in our authorities. Because within our society, like sex with 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, whatever, it's generally seen as, well, that's fine. Kids growing up, they have sex when they're teenagers. What's the problem with that? That's perfectly normal, natural and healthy. That's what children have been led to believe, and that's what the authorities believe. So when they hear about a case, here's a 13-year-old girl that's been having sex, they'll think, okay, yeah, fine, perfectly normal, nothing to worry about whatsoever. Alongside that, we've got the sexualization of children, particularly through online pornography. So children are growing up in a context where it's normal, it's communicated to them as normal to have sex from a very young age, and also they learn a lot, a very distorted picture of sex as well from pornography and other influences in society. Problem number 1. Now, problem number 2, closely related to that. So that's a serious problem in society. So what do governments do, especially in Scotland? They exacerbate that by providing sex education that reinforces those messages. You just have sex whenever you feel like it, as long as you consent. And by consent, they mean if you feel like it. Only have sex if you really feel like it. And you say yes because you feel like having sex. And also, probably contraception's a good idea as well. Children in Scotland, I've realised reading the book, this applies in England to a large degree as well. The government wants children teaching about their sexual rights. And the idea of sexual rights is basically at any age, you've got the right to explore your sexuality in safe and pleasurable ways. That's the sort of line. That's what children are taught in school in Scotland. They're saying that there's no ages put with that. That's just a general principle. In Scotland, they've got Dr. Colin Morrison in charge of sex education, who wrote about the needs to break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality. So there'll be cases where children have been to these lessons and then they'll like simulate having sex with each other. In some cases they've gone home and said to their parents, I'd really like to have sex with a boy, girl, whatever. Some cases obviously they try to have sex or have had sex with other boys and girls. And there's a case in Scotland not too long ago, it was reported in the media, where the pupils were taught a lesson, an RSHP lesson, and immediately afterwards some of the class went to the unisex toilets. Obviously, we're very enlightened in Scotland, have unisex toilets, and some boys sexually abused a girl, sexually assaulted a girl. That was immediately after the sex education lesson. So again, from the point of view of the abusers, this sort of sex education is really making their task easier. So it's normalizing sex, and it's saying to the children, if you want to have sex, then you can. You just go ahead. That's absolutely fine by us. Right, number 3. The age of consent as it's understood by authorities. Because the general understanding among authorities, social work, police, education, etc., is that children, teenagers, they're mini adults really. So having sex is normal, nothing to worry about. But of course, a lot of sexual abuse takes place between teenagers. For example, a 16-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. Even if it's like two 15-year-olds, that relationship could still be highly abusive. But the culture is, if you hear that some teenager having sex, then you don't need to ask anything about it. There have been cases where even a girl's been going for an abortion, and they're never even asked about who the father is. There's no investigation whatsoever. If they had investigated, they might have found that the father was a 42-year-old Pakistani taxi driver, for example. But the question is not even asked. You don't even need to ask because 15-year-old, 13-year-old, whatever, having sex, that's just absolutely fine. Because the idea is that they're autonomous. They can make their own choices. This is just ordinary adolescent behavior. Again, they're quotes from reports saying that these were the attitudes shown by authorities. In Rotherham, it was deemed in one case that an 11-year-old girl was capable of consenting to sexual activity. Now, I would say, of course, even if, say, a 13-year-old girl has consented to sex, does that suddenly make it safe and okay and normal, natural, healthy? Absolutely not. No matter what the circumstance, a 13-year-old girl having sex is not, or boy for that matter, is not good. That is detrimental to their sexual development and their relational journey throughout life. Right, problem number 4. The age of consent as understood by children. Now, children are taught in Scotland, and I realise now it's in England as well, okay, the age of consent is 16, but actually it's not really, it's really 13. As long as the other person isn't too much older or younger than you, then it's sort of okay. So the age of consent, okay, technically it's 16, but obviously it doesn't really mean that. Now, you could say in these grooming gangs where you've got, say, a young girl and a much, much older man, you could say, well, that's still illegal. The children should know that's still illegal. But on the other hand, once you've breached the boundary and said to, for example, a 13-year-old girl, it's actually okay for you to have sex, as long as, but this is the first part that's important, you've crossed the boundary and say you, as a 13-year-old girl, can choose to have sex within certain conditions. So therefore they'll think, okay, if I break those conditions, well, that can't be too big a deal, can it? It's not as though I'm too young to consent to sex. It's just that the law says this man might be a bit too old. So it's lowered the barrier very significantly. Sometimes, obviously, the men will lie about their age. But if you imagine yourself as an abuser trying to persuade, say, a 13-year-old girl to have sex, then you're going to have an easier time if her value system, her beliefs, her background philosophy, if you like, is that it's actually okay to have sex as a 13-year-old girl. And schools, particularly in Scotland, are giving that message to pupils. Right, number 5. The provision of contraception and abortions. Now, there's significant evidence to show that this is counterproductive. The idea is if you dole out condoms, then there's going to be less sexually transmitted diseases, there'll be less abortions. The evidence is that doesn't work. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. But what we've got here, if you say to, again, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, come along, we'll give you free contraception. But no questions asked. Message, we don't particularly care who you're having sex with, we'll provide you with these things. So it's the state endorsing illegal underage sex. And that is very, very harmful message to give. Now, with the case of abortions as well, so young girls could go for an abortion, maybe because they've been abused, they've been raped, and they go for an abortion. Again, it can often be no questions asked. There's no need to ask questions, because a girl getting pregnant at 13, well, that's just normal. We don't need to look into that, don't need to investigate. Just give her the abortion, keep it secret in many cases, and that is that. Now, there were testimonies to some of these inquiries where girls in this situation said afterwards they really wish that they'd been asked about these things. So they're going for an abortion, they're embarrassed about what's going on, they're frightened, they're unsure what to do, they'd sort of like someone to intervene, they're not happy. Well, that's an understatement. And so they'll go and speak to doctor or some sort of professionals, and in some cases the girls said they really wish the people had said, tell me about what's happening. Who got you pregnant? Is everything okay? They really wish those conversations had happened. And if those conversations had been started, they might well have opened up and spoken about the abuse that they were suffering. Right, number 6, confidentiality. Anyone who works with children will know that officialdom is very much concerned with confidentiality, huge emphasis on it. So, for example, if a 16-year-old girl discloses that she's having a sexual relationship with a 40-year-old man, then confidentiality would say, well, that's legal. That's fine. We don't tell anyone. We mustn't tell the parents. That's just up to the girl, and we don't need to ask any more questions about that. We'll keep that confidential. Now, again, with this case, there were girls who said they really wish their parents had been told. They hadn't got the nerve. It was too difficult. It was too embarrassing to actually go to the parents themselves. You might say, oh, come on, grow up. Okay, you could say, we're talking about young girls here. You can imagine, say, a 13-year-old girl who's really worried about, embarrassed about talking about this, and they really wish that someone had gone to tell their parents about it, but the people didn't even investigate in many cases, and certainly didn't say, we need to tell your parents about it. Which brings us on to number 7. Problem number 7, parents being excluded from the process. In these reports, it was detailed in many cases that the concerns of parents, which turned out to be valid, gravely serious concerns, were dismissed. I mean, one quotation from one of the reports is, it was recorded that some parents were unable to accept that their daughter was growing up. In other words, they were worried that their underage daughter was in a sexual relationship with an older man in some cases. They classed that as the parents being unable to accept the daughter is growing up. There's another case, quite remarkable, where the daughter had sort of run away from home, disappeared, kidnapped, or whatever you want to call it, but is living with an abuser. And the police described the father as being obsessed with finding his daughter. You can imagine the father, he would have his suspicions with good reason that an abusive relationship was taking place. He wanted to find his daughter, he wanted to rescue her, went to the police, please help me. And so this bloke's obsessed. He's obsessed with finding his daughter. What a weirdo. Why can't he be like a proper father and just say, oh, well, whatever, leave it to it, or whatever will be, will be. There's another case where a girl was at a location where the parents didn't know and she was being abused, and the police did know where she was. The police didn't directly know she was being abused. As far as they're concerned, maybe there's a sexual relationship, but so what? Maybe the girl was 16, so there was no problem. And the parents were told, it's none of your business. It's none of your business to find out where your daughter's been abused so you can go and rescue her. Right, something quite far wrong here, isn't there? Right, number 8, attitudes to drugs and alcohol. In some of these abusive gangs, their modus operandi at some points would be to introduce the girls to drugs and alcohol. In other words, get them blind drunk, get them behind some sort of drugs in order to abuse them. Now, if you look at the education children receive in Scotland, is it that, like getting drunk, taking illegal drugs, you just don't do that? That's something you run a mile from. If someone's trying to get you drunk or share drugs with you, then that's just totally wrong. Do not do it. Run. Get home and get away from it. Absolutely not. That is not the message at all. The message is harm reduction. So be careful. So if you're going to get totally drunk, make sure you know how you're going to get home. So if you're going to stay at your abuser's house that night, then you don't need to worry about how to get home. So I suppose getting drunk isn't such a big deal. And taking drugs, okay, it may be illegal, everyone knows that, but everyone does it, don't they? So if you take drugs, obviously you want to make sure you know what they are, and have a drink of water with them, or whatever you're supposed to do. Make sure there's people with you to look after you when you're on drugs, etc. So this is the sort of culture children are being brought up in. And so when an abuser wants to ply a girl with drink and drugs, alcohol and drugs, then he's going to have an easier job because of the attitude to alcohol and drugs that's been inculcated in the girl by the education system. In most cases, I'm not talking about all schools, but in the mainstream schools as a result of the Scottish Government's policies. Right, number 9, and finally, total lack of sexual morality. The way these things are dealt with, I say particularly the way things are presented in schools, is that there's just no moral standard at all. Apart from maybe consent, but apart from that, anything goes. I mean, my moral standard with regard to sexuality is that the only context for sexual relationship is man and woman who are married. And other than that, it's wrong. So the idea that like 13-year-old can have sex with a 15-year-old, whatever, well, just no. It doesn't matter about consent. Doesn't matter how loving and caring the relationship is. Doesn't matter what they intend for the future. That's just wrong. So on my morality, what's going on here, there would be really red flags left, right and centre to everyone involved. We'd be thinking, whoa, this just shouldn't be happening. But on the moral standard or lack of, promoted by the Scottish Government, for example, the same in the rest of the UK as well, the moral standard is, well, there isn't really a moral standard. As long as you both sort of feel like it, that's okay. So restoring some sort of moral philosophy of sexual behaviour is a priority. Right, so what would we do as the Scottish Family Party? Obviously, most of those is obvious. You reverse the problem. You do the opposite of what's happening at the moment. Now, when it comes to the age of consent, what would we do? What should happen if two 15-year-olds have sex? I mean, should they be sent to a young offenders institution or something? Well, I believe probably in the first instance, a caution would be appropriate. So they're called to the police station. Their parents are called there as well. Maybe the head teacher as well. With all those people together, the police deliver a stern caution and warning that if there's a repeat of this, it won't just be a caution, some other sort of action will be taken. I think that is appropriate, and I think that culture that would promote would protect children from this sort of abuse. Now, it's interesting to think about this. I'll talk about the general culture of society. If you imagine that, let's go say before 1960, let's say, a 13-year-old girl in 1955, say, and let's say there was some budding grooming gang who wanted to operate the sort of way they do now. How would they have found it? How easy would that be? So they'll go to this average 13-year-old in 1955, say, and say, right, have a drink of this. Let's get drunk, alcohol, have a drink. What would the girl think? She'd probably think, what? No way. I'm only 13. That's totally wrong. I can't. You're not. No way. There's something wrong here. I'm going. If they said, right, drugs, fancy an injection of this, fancy a smoke of this, I mean, they would just think, this is just utterly bizarre. This is appalling. I don't know what's going on here. Again, they would just be out the door and they'd be running home to tell mum and dad and to tell the police in no time. If someone's suggesting like having sex, I mean, again, the girl would probably think, no, this is absolutely beyond the pale. What sort of pervert is this? This is absolute outrage going on here. I am in grave danger from these totally weird people suggesting that I should have sex at the age of 13. I mean, this is just totally appalling. And again, out the door, running home. Now, if that girl had had some sort of sex education at school, probably all it would have covered would be watch out, there are some men out there who will abuse you. Be careful, keep away from them, run away from them. That's probably what they would have had in terms of sex education. Now, if that was the culture today, would these grooming gangs have been able to operate the way they did? Well, I think it would have been a lot more difficult. Now, it's a very interesting point to make here, that all the things I've said so far in this video, if you are a mainstream Muslim living in Scotland or the UK, I would imagine you'll be saying to almost everything I've said, you'll be saying, yeah, totally agree. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? So, general Islamic values would very much support what I've said here. On the other hand, I mean, these crimes largely have been committed by like Muslim Pakistani men. Now, why that is, I've talked about that on other occasions. That's not a topic I shy away from speaking about. I have spoken about on other occasions. I think it's one of the reasons why we need a national public inquiry, to absolutely get to the bottom of what factors led to this happening, in particular among Muslim Pakistani men. I think we need answers to that, and a public inquiry would provide them. So who's going to promote a positive culture of sexual relationships and marriage in Britain, which is the antidote in some ways to these sort of crimes? The Conservatives going to do it? Well, they never have so far. No sign they're going to do it in the future. Reform? Nigel Farage? Really? Is he interested in this sort of socially conservative values, promoting marriage? I don't think so. Elon Musk, with his 11 kids, and he's trying to get their 3 mothers and himself living together on one compound. Is he the man to be promoting traditional family values? I don't think so. John Swinney? Well, absolutely not. John Swinney fuels sexual abuse in Scotland by presenting a sex education programme that promotes exactly the values that help make sexual abuse easier for abusers. It lowers the barriers for sexual abusers to abuse children. So I'll say that again. John Swinney fuels child sex abuse in Scotland. The whole SNP does. So Kate Forbes, yep, you're responsible as well. All the SNP, they are responsible for promoting the sexualisation of children, which makes abuse more likely. So if you don't want these things countering and a positive vision replacing these problems, then you need to support the Scottish Family Party. And the way to do that is to join us right now. There is a link below. Thanks for watching.